from Bangkok speaking. Welcome to the side event of the 78th session of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. My name is Raja Muzina from ESCAP Transport Division, and I will take care of the first part of this meeting and the opening session. So let me just check. Yes, we're all set. Welcome to the participants joining us on site. Welcome to the participants joining us virtually. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the side event on transforming Asia-Pacific trade and transport agreements and other initiatives to future-proof supply chain connectivity in Asia and the Pacific. This meeting is the side event is co-organized by the government of Uzbekistan in cooperation with the ESCAP Transport Division and the ESCAP Trade, Investment and Innovation Division. The meeting offers the interpretation into English and Russian, so you should be able to switch between languages as needed. The scope of this meeting and the theme of this meeting is the leveraging, transforming Asia-Pacific trade and transport agreement in the context of the disruption of international supply and logistic chains caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, which revealed weaknesses of trade and transport regulatory regimes at regional and global levels during those extraordinary situations. So during this side event, we will have an opportunity to discuss the ways in which the existing and future trade and transport agreements or other initiatives can ensure greater resilience of supply chain connectivity during major disruptions. As you will have seen from the draft program and the invitation, we're privileged to have with us two speakers for the opening session. Mr. Fakhriddin Sultanov, Consul General Permanent Representative to ESCAP of Uzbekistan, and we have with us Mr. Wei Min Ren from the ESCAP Transport Division. Unfortunately, His Excellency Mr. Colin Vixen Kelapile, the President of ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, who had initially planned to open a meeting, was detained and traveled only today to Bangkok, so he is not able to join us today. So let me, from the Secretariat, introduce our first opening speaker, Mr. Fakhriddin Sultanov, Permanent Representative of Uzbekistan to ESCAP. As perhaps many of you know, Uzbekistan has been actively engaging in the ESCAP connectivity work, and I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate them on joining the Intergovernmental Agreement on Dry Ports. That was a recent development at the end of 2021, and we would of course like to thank Uzbekistan for organizing this timely side event. So Mr. Fakhriddin Sultanov, I see you online, you are joining us online. Please, the floor is yours for your opening remarks. You will need to unmute yourself and open your camera. Thank you.
Good morning. Distinguished participants, on behalf of the government of Uzbekistan, I welcome you to the side event organized in cooperation with an ESCAP. I would like to express my deep appreciation to His Excellency Mr. Colin Kelapile for taking time out of his very busy schedule and attend today's discussion. But by the last update that we just know that he is not available. And the issue of resilience of supply chain connectivity lies at the core of Uzbekistan priorities and interests. As a double landlocked country, Uzbekistan relies on the uninterrupted and seamless and sustainable flow of goods across the borders. For the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, many other countries in Asia and Pacific find themselves in the similar circumstances. During the pandemic, our government has taken national measures to digitalize and streamlines trade and transport procedures, but we are mindful of the central role of regional cooperation in facing connectivity challenges. Uzbekistan took a very active part in the preparation for the last year's fourth ministerial conference on transport, which stressed the importance of the efficient and resilient transport and the logistics networks, and agreed on a concrete steps towards future-proofing our transport linkages. Similarly, Uzbekistan has promptly introduced measures to facilitate trade during the pandemic, including customs clearance mechanisms such as issuing permits before entering the territory. And I hope that our side event today will contribute towards accumulation of regional knowledge and the best practices in this area. And I'm pleased that Uzbekistan will have an opportunity to showcase some of the ongoing initiatives on making the regional connectivity more resilient and sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Mr. Sultanov, for your kind words of introduction and support to this event. And let me now give the floor to the next opening speaker, Mr. Wei Min Ren from the Transport Division. He will be delivering the opening remarks on behalf not only the Transport Division, but our colleagues from the Trade, Investment and Innovation Division. As some of you know, for the last 2.5 years during the pandemic, the two divisions worked very actively with the rest of the UN system on a special project that aimed at helping member states preserve trade and transport connectivity during the pandemic. So as a sign of this joint work, we will have this joint statement. So please, Wei Min, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Azar. Excellencies, distinguished participants, please allow me on behalf of ESCAP Transport Division and ESCAP Trade, Investment and Innovation Division, join Mr. Sultanov, permanent representative of Uzbekistan to ESCAP, in welcoming you to this side event, which continues the theme of the high-level roundtable of the 78th session of ESCAP, dedicated to ensuring resilient supply chains and connectivity. Trade and transport connectivity is one of the core mandates of our regional commission. And for many decades, both divisions for trade and transport have been assisting our member states in strengthening the positioning of Asia and the Pacific in global supply chains. As a result of this work, the institutional landscape of trade and transport cooperation in the region changed profoundly, giving rise to region-wide legal instruments on digital trade and transport connectivity. For the last 3 years, the Transport Division and the Trade, Investment and Innovation Division of ESCAP have been working hand in hand in helping our member countries deal with the most challenging circumstances caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. One typical example is the implementation of the UN-wide Special Response Project on transport and trade connectivity in the age of pandemics, contactless, seamless, and collaborative UN solutions, led by ESCAP together with UNCTAD and UNECE. This unique project combined the strengths of global learning and global norms with the regional expertise and experience. And I'm very pleased to report that a variety of best practices in preserving and enhancing connectivity during the pandemic came from Asia and the Pacific. Today, we will hear more about this project and benefit from seeing both trade and transport perspectives and lessons learned. We will see the similarity across the sectors and opportunities for cross-fertilization of ideas. This is particularly visible in the work done on the model provisions for trade and transport agreements, as most of existing ones had proven to be insufficiently prepared for the periods of great disruptions. In trade area, we have already started translating this work into freely accessible e-learning courses and practical handbooks, benefiting more than 600 trade negotiators and policy analysts across the globe during the second half of year 2021. On the transport side, our reference model for bilateral and multilateral transport agreements has been updated to incorporate the crisis-related provisions to encourage our member states to make their transport agreements better equipped for preserving connectivity during the disruptions. The resilience of the regional land and maritime transport and the logistics network is now also one of the key areas of the new regional action program on sustainable transport development 2022 to 2026, adopted at the recent ministerial conference on transport in December 2021. I very much look forward to our panel discussion today, and I'm sure that the experience and ideas shared will enrich ESCAP's work on trade and transport connectivity for the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ren, and to our colleagues from the Trade, Investment and Innovation Division and our esteemed permanent representative of Uzbekistan for your opening remarks. We shall now move to the substantive part of this side event, where we will have, as you will see in the program, a combination of both transport and trade experts, and again, a combination of governments, international organizations, and trade practitioners that which going to share their experience and good practices on preserving and enhancing trade and transport connectivity. So for that part, I will rely on the assistance of my colleague, Mr. Fedor Kormelitsyn from ESCAP Transport Division, who will moderate the substantive panel discussion of this event. So please, Fedor, go ahead and take us through the substantive part. Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Ren.
Excellencies and distinguished participants, it is my great honor to moderate this substantive part of today's side event. And during that next session, we will hear from experts on several recent initiatives and activities in different parts of our region on adjusting agreements as well as other regulatory frameworks for trade and transport with an aim to address the new operational modalities as well as emerging challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And I also review some ideas on how to strengthen the regulatory frameworks in order to ensure the adaptability for other potential critical situations they unfortunately may occur in the future. So for this session, we have 5 speakers who will both, as already mentioned, cover different aspects. Some of them will be mostly focused on transport initiatives and some on trade initiatives, since trade and transport are pretty much interconnected. And I would like to kindly remind all speakers that due to very limited time that we have, please kindly limit your intervention to exactly 10 minutes and not more. I thank you for your kind understanding. So the first speaker in our list is Mr. Abdullah Hashimov, Head of Transport Corridors Development and Logistic Department of the Ministry of Investments and Foreign Trade of Uzbekistan. Mr. Hashimov has an extensive working experience with the Ministries of Transport, Foreign Affairs, Investment and Foreign Trade of Uzbekistan, focusing on the problems of the development of national and international transport system. He also chaired the National Committee of Uzbekistan for the development of the Trans-Caucasian transport corridors and the transport sector of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Secretariat. Mr. Hashimov, the floor is yours now, please.
Добрый день. Спасибо большое, господин Кормилицын, уважаемая госпожа Джаймурзина, уважаемые дамы и господа. Позвольте от имени Министерства инвестиций и внешней торговли передать слова признательности секретариату ESCAP, Департаменту транспорта и Департаменту торговли и инвестиций за созыв этой встречи. Повестка дня актуальна, и мы выступаем за опережающее развитие торговли, транспорта и коммуникации на пространстве ESCAP. Сотрудничество с ESCAP имеет для Узбекистана приоритетное значение. Так, в текущем году около 60% внешней торговли Узбекистана придется на страны членов ESCAP. Объем грузовых перевозок ожидается на уровне около 3 миллионов тонн, в том числе 2 миллиона 400 тысяч тонн железнодорожным транспортом. Вместе с тем надо сказать, что объем торговли и грузовых перевозок пока не отвечает огромному потенциалу стран-членов ESCAP. Пандемия, как было уже сказано господином Веймерен, наиболее ярко осветила слабые стороны международной торговли и логистики, в том числе в пространстве ESCAP. За последние 2 года стоимость перевозки условного контейнера между восточными портами Китая и Узбекистаном выросла в 3 раза. Сроки перевозки составляют более 2 месяцев. Эти факторы несут мультипликативный и кумулятивный эффект. Так, удлинение сроков поставки оборудования, машин и механизмов привели к замедлению пуска сотен инвестиционных проектов на общую сумму более 7 миллиардов долларов. Наиболее острый характер носило увеличение безработицы и, очевидно, бедности. Аналогичную ситуацию можно наблюдать и по другим странам Центральной Азии. В этих сложных условиях правительство нашей страны разработало и внедрило ряд неотложных экономических механизмов по сохранению устойчивости внешней торговли и транспорта. В самом начале пандемии мы ввели программу государственной поддержки экспорта, расширение налоговых таможенных льгот, кредитования, отсрочки возврата займов, ускорение возврата НДС, стимулирование государственно-частного партнерства, предоставление компенсации до 70% транспортных затрат при осуществлении перевозки экспортных товаров. В целом, Анализируя уроки пандемии, нельзя не сказать, что главным инструментом в международном преодолении последствий пандемии является повышение эффективности сотрудничества в рамках ESCAP. Мы приносим слова признательности секретариату, департаменту транспорта за активную работу в период пандемии и постпандемии. Совместно с вами мы преодолеваем ковид. Однако уровень новых вызовов и угроз устойчивому росту мировой экономики и международной торговли не снижается. В этой связи хотел бы внести ряд предложений. Во-первых, необходимо нам совместно провести анализ причин и объема ущерба, нанесенного пандемией на международную торговлю, транспорт и логистику в регионах ESCAP. Обобщить передовой опыт борьбы с пандемией и выработать конкретные предложения по вопросам дальнейшего совершенствования нормативной и правовой базы ESCAP. Наверное, нужно определить самые уязвимые в отношении новых вызовов и угроз страны-члены ESCAP. Выработать консолидированные решения по оказанию им помощи, в том числе методической и методологической. Мы также считали бы целесообразным проработать новые механизмы, направленные на расширение благоприятных условий для транзита грузов внутри континентальных стран в международных морских портах. Следовало бы пересмотреть стратегию развития транспорта и транзита в рамках Центральной, Южной Азии и в дальнейшем ESCAP в целом. Нужно идентифицировать степень альтернативности международных транспортных коридоров. Узбекистан в этой связи придает приоритет развитию мультимодального транспортного коридора Китай, Центральная Азия, Южный Кавказ, Европа. Строительству узбекско-китайско-киргизской железной дороги. Продвижению грузоперевозок через порты Пакистана с выходом в Афганистан и Центральную Азию. Этот коридор привлекательный. Достаточно сказать, что объем торговли между Индией, Пакистаном, Бангладеш и странами СНГ в прошлом году превысил 20 миллиардов долларов. Мы ожидаем от ESCAP, от Департамента транспорта системной поддержки создания нового транзитного коридора с использованием иранского порта Чабахар, который свяжет Индию со странами Центральной Азии. Второй блок вопросов связан с новым видением системы транспортирования в целом, его комбинированности, инклюзивности, модальности, унификации и гармонизации товарно-транспортных документов, дальнейшей цифровизации и, естественно, повышение качества управленческого персонала. Департамент транспорта ESCAP делает много полезной работы в этом направлении, и мы ожидаем его дальнейшего расширения и повышения качества. На примере ASEAN мы видим эффективность реализации и кооперации промышленности, создания новых экономических коридоров. В этой связи мы предлагаем ESCAP рассмотреть возможность присоединения к проекту формирования нового экономического коридора Южный Казахстан, Ташкент, Ташкентская область, Северный Таджикистан, Сагдийская область, город Худжанд. Этот проект мы внедряем в рамках ЦАРЕС, Азиатского банка развития. Уважаемые дамы и господа, Министерская конференция ESCAP, которая состоялась в декабре прошлого года, одобрила резолюцию о создании в Ташкенте регионального центра развития транспорта и коммуникации под эгидой ООН. В этой связи хотел бы принести слова признательности всем делегациям, поддержавшими это предложение. Центр будет заниматься анализом актуальных проблем, связанных с Центральной Азией, и выработкой новых экономически обоснованных проектов и предложений в рамках ESCAP. Мы будем благодарны за предложения стран-членов ESCAP по вопросам создания и развития указанного центра в Ташкенте. Я от имени Министерства инвестиций и внешней торговли Узбекистана хотел бы пригласить делегацию секретариата ESCAP, департамента транспорта, а также торговли и инвестиций в Ташкент в июле, в августе для более подробного обсуждения этих вопросов и подписания соответствующих документов. Спасибо большое за ваше внимание. Спасибо.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hashimov, for your statement, full of very thoughtful and concrete proposals indicating possible directions of cooperation in Central Asia and beyond. And I think I will express the common opinion of the ESCAP Transport Division that will be interested to further discuss these details in further discuss these initiatives in further detail. In fact, we have a number of ongoing work which focuses on Central Asia, and hope there will be a lot of synergy found. Thank you very much once again. The next speaker on my list is the representative of the ASEAN Secretariat, Mr. Beni Irzanto. He works as a senior officer of Transport Division, Sectoral Development Directorate in the ASEAN Economic Community Department. He will share information on COVID-19 response and recovery guidelines, which was designed to support ASEAN member states in establishing their regional and national transport connectivity recovery plans. Please, Mr. Irzanto, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fedor. His Excellency, Mr. Fakhriddin Sultanov, Consul General and Permanent Representative of Uzbekistan to ESCAP, Mr. Wayman Ren, Director, Transport Division of ESCAP, Excellencies and distinguished participants. Good afternoon. My name is Beni Irzanto. I'm a Senior Officer of Transport Division of ASEAN Secretariat. First of all, thank you very much, ESCAP, for inviting me to this event. I would like also to congratulate ESCAP for convening the 78th session of the Commission. I will share information on the policy response from ASEAN to the COVID-19 pandemic in the form of guidelines focusing on international and cross-border road freight transport connectivity in ASEAN, which would help to coordinate and mitigate the effect of supply chain disruptions, as well as to streamline the exchange of information during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Next slide, please. First, I would like to highlight the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its implementation plan as one of the ASEAN initiatives mandating the development of these guidelines. This framework serves as the consolidated strategy to exit from the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, and it articulates ASEAN response through different stages of recovery. It focuses on key sectors and segments of society that are most affected by the pandemic, including transport as one of the sectors mostly impacted by the pandemic. To support the implementation, implementation plan of the ASEAN and the framework itself were adopted at the 37th ASEAN Summit in 2020. And strengthening supply chain connectivity and resilience is one of the key priorities of this implementation plan. Therefore, the COVID-19 recovery guidelines for resilient and sustainable international road freight transport connectivity in ASEAN is included as one of the initiatives to strengthen recovery and resilience of transport facilitation and connectivity. Next slide, please. Before explaining further on the details of the guidelines, I would like to provide some background information on the discussions towards the establishment of these guidelines. On 9 July 2020, a webinar was held, jointly organized by ESCAP and supported by ESCAP and also organized by the International Transport Forum, as well as with the ASEAN Secretariat with the topic on preserving transport connectivity and building freight transport resilience in ASEAN. The objective is to exchange information on transport response to the COVID-19 pandemic crisis with focus on cross-border road freight transport operations in ASEAN. There are some key outputs from the discussion of the webinar, in particular on the need for more strengthened regional cooperation to respond to the pandemic, setting up information exchange mechanisms to identify key nodes or corridors to be preserved if there is any future disruptions, and also to consider to develop regional and national transport connectivity recovery plans with focus on resilience and sustainability. The most important thing is to agree for ASEAN to develop regional COVID-19 recovery guidelines with support from ESCAP and ITF. Next slide, please. The COVID-19 response and recovery guidelines was developed by the ASEAN Transport Facilitating Working Group as a follow-up to the joint webinar held in July 2020. The guidelines was first adopted by the ASEAN Senior Transport Officials meeting in January 2021. But since there has been recent updates, the first revised edition was completed in April 2022 to cater the recent development of the pandemic. These guidelines support ASEAN member states in establishing regional and national transport connectivity recovery. In particular, because cross-border transport connectivity is vulnerable to disruptions such as pandemic, supply chain distortion, and natural disasters. So the recovery measure should build on greater resilience and as well as to increase efficiency and ensure sustainability in the long run. You can see that this guideline serves as basically guidance to ASEAN member states to respond to the supply chain disruptions and the pandemic. Next slide, please. I would like to explain some of the findings from the survey, which is used to develop the guidelines. Based on the survey, basically, the response that we received, the disruption on road freight transport seems to be moderate. This is since policy measures were implemented to mitigate the disruptions. However, most of the survey shows that the cross-border freight operations have become more costly or time-consuming due to COVID-19. Although ASEAN member states have shared information on their policy responses to COVID-19 pandemic at the various ASEAN transport meetings, there is also a further need to set up a common platform for sharing information on these situations. And we also found that actually cross-border freight operations is basically driven by both supply and demand side factors, as well as by the need to keep essential services operating. Therefore, there would be a need to do some improvement, in particular on transport efficiency. In this regard, that actually there is a need to maximize load factor because there is a decrease in the operationalization, but there is still demand growing, especially for the essential goods and medicines. Next slide, please. The main guiding principles and the policy actions from the guidelines are basically articulated into three priorities. First is ensuring transport worker safety and training. Second one is to preserve connectivity for efficient and resilient supply chain. Third is to build back better through digital resilience and decarbonized transport connectivity. There are also three time frame to respond to this pandemic: immediate or current response, medium-term response, and long-term response. There are some recommendations on policy actions, as you see that for the ensuring road transport worker safety, it will follow the international standards, and also balancing transport connectivity and protecting worker safety, as well as through implementation of digitalization and transport resilience, as well as decarbonization of transport sector. Next slide, please. In particular, the first revised edition held in April 2000, completed in April this year, provides also recommendations for post-pandemic policy adjustments, noting the recent development of the pandemic situation. Some recommendations are to basically to retain policy measures with a positive impact on digitalization and decarbonization, such as digitalization of transactions for transport permits, certificates, and licenses, to regularly review the remaining restrictions and remove them along the phasing out of a pandemic, such as by phasing out cross-border transport restrictions for movement of goods and passengers, and also to ensure transparency and necessary flow of information in easing up transport restrictions in order to benefit transport operators on these changes, such as to promptly publish import, export, and transit-related information based on Global Trade Facilitation Agreement of the WTO. And also, I think the most interesting recommendation is also to revisit current transport agreements to guarantee the resilience during future pandemic. For example, to consider a minimum set of provisions to be included in the fourth major clause. In this regard, I would like to thank ESCAP for providing some reference, such as ESCAP study on proposals for crisis response provisions and regional and bilateral transport agreements of the ESCAP member states, which provided suggestions for a proactive approach in order for such force majeure to be treated in a more sensible manner to anticipate future transport disruption. Next slide, please. In this opportunity, I would like also to provide some suggested actions for post-pandemic responses, noting that I think in some countries we see there have been relaxing policies toward cross-border travel. In particular, the suggestion is to further consider capacity building to support implementation of the guidelines, focusing on recommendations for post-pandemic adjustments in transport policies, and also to continue exchange of information among countries to ensure coordinated actions in opening land border and for the transparency of cross-border policy measures between adjacent countries. The other suggested action is to build competency based on lessons learned from the pandemic, such as to set up database of policy responses during pandemic and to have analysis of the mitigated actions to the pandemic and share this information through to the relevant countries. And also the most important thing is to have a more coordinated approach to anticipate supply chain disruptions in the future. For example, due to the pandemic or maybe also due to the natural disasters. That's all my presentations, and I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benny, for your very informative presentation, because you covered, highlighted the main aspects of that very important and practical tool developed at the ASEAN level. Another example of good coordination and integration of ASEAN countries, and we were happy as the ESCAP Secretariat to be able to provide technical support to the development of this tool. Thank you very much. good example for sub-regional cooperation. My next speaker is Mr. Ali Abdullahi, head of International Organizations Group in the International Affairs Department of the Iranian Railways, Islamic Republic of Iran. The floor is yours, Mr. Abdullahi, please.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to attend in this side event of the ESCAP, and I thank ESCAP and also organizer for inviting Iranian Railways and providing opportunity for us to have a presentation about our transport connectivity and our activity for increasing the connectivity in the region, especially with CIS countries, and also some measures which we have taken for confront the effects of the coronavirus pandemic, and also main activities which we hope that in the post-pandemic area through the lesson learned from this pandemic will increase the share of the rail transport and transit in our region. Now just let me share my presentation. First of all, I just briefly, in the short time which is available, I would like to mention to the international rail network of the Iranian Railways, which is connected to our neighbor countries. Actually, connection to the neighbor countries and developing the freight transport is one of the high priorities of the Iranian Railways, which also supported by our government. Our railway network is connected to Turkey and also with, connected to Pakistan. We have connected to Afghanistan. We have constructed our rail network until the border with Iraq. And
Mr. Abdullahi, I'm
yes.
so sorry. If you could wait just a moment. Yeah, there it is. The presentation is there. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Sorry again.
Okay, no. Now, next slide, please. Let's go to the next slide. Yes. Actually, yes, I was explaining about our rail connection with our neighbor countries, which we are connected to Turkey, and through the Turkey to Europe railway network. We have also our rail network also is connected to Pakistan, and also we have our rail network is also connected to Afghanistan through the Shamtil border, and also our rail network is connected to the CIS countries, which I will focus on it in my next slide. Next slide, please. Iranian Railways also connected to some main important ports in our country. Bandar Abbas port in south of Iran, which is one of the main important ports in Persian Gulf for export, import, and transit of cargoes, and also to Imam Khomeini port, Khorramshahr port, and also our rail network is connected to Amirabad port in north of Iran in Caspian Sea. Next slide, please. Our railway network is supported by some dry ports. All of you know the importance of the dry port, and the ESCAP also has some cooperation with Iranian Railways, including some of our important dry ports in the intergovernmental dry port agreement of the ESCAP. Next slide, please. Now you see the map of the international rail corridor crossing through Iran. This is a general view, and now I would like to focus on some important international rail corridors passing through Iran. Next slide, please. As you may know, most of our rail transport and transit in CIS countries, we can say that almost 75% of our international rail transport with CIS countries. Iranian Railway is connected to the CIS railway network through Turkmenistan from two border stations. One is Sarax station, and the other is Inchaburun station. Inchaburun is in the north of Iran, and Sarax station is in the northeast of Iran. Next station, next slide, please. Now, one of the most important East-West corridor, which transport cargoes from China to Iran and also to Turkey, and it is also the southern route of the Silk Road, is the corridor of China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran. This corridor is fully rail route, and the entrance of this corridor from to Iran is through Sarax border in Turkmenistan. Next slide, please. Also, we have another rail route from China towards Iran, is China, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Iran. This corridor enters to Iran through Inchaburun border in north of Iran. And next slide, please. Actually, for this corridor, we had the support of the ESCAP with the cooperation of ECU and Islamic Development Bank for the making, let's say, doing some commercializing study for this corridor. The studies actually were done by ESCAP, and finally an MOU was signed between Iran, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan on the sideline of the Economic Cooperation Organization Summit meeting in Turkmenistan in 26th of November for 2021. And now a permanent expert working group has been established for this corridor in order to change it to economic corridor and trying to absorbing, transporting more cargoes from this route. Next slide, please. Also, there's another route. Of course, this is let's say combined route from China towards Iran, which Iranian Railways also is working on it. That is China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran. As you know, this route is from Kashgar to Kyrgyzstan until Ush by road transport, and then from Kyrgyzstan to Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran by rail transport. Next slide, please. We are also working on launching train, let's say scheduled trains from China to Iran through the mentioned routes which I mentioned. Since 2016, almost 40 container trains came to Iran through this route which I mentioned. Of course, we had also three trains from Iran to China. But after the coronavirus pandemic, unfortunately, the movement of the trains stopped. But now we had recently good negotiations with Kyrgyzstan and also with our neighbor countries. We are going to have some five-party agreement between China, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Iran for launching trains from China to Iran and also to Europe through Iran and Turkey. Next slide, please.
Mr. Abdullahi, I'm sorry, but you have just 1 minute.
Okay, I will. So let's do next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. Just these are our corridors. Because of short time, I pass from them. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, just in 1 minute, I wanted to mention that because of the importance of the electronic data exchange with our neighbor countries, which has very important effect on increasing the speed of transport and avoiding the stop of the wagons in our border stations, we have established a working group of the electronic data exchange in Iran Railways to have the electronic data exchange with our neighbors and customs. Next slide, please. We have also had the favor of ESCAP for supporting us in doing a study for rail digital exchange between Iran and Turkmenistan. Next slide, please. And we had also a proposal of Iran for adding a new annex to as the Annex 3 of the Trans-Asian Railway Agreement, which was welcomed in the 7th biannual meeting of the Working Group of Trans-Asian Railway Network in 2021. My last and final message is that, considering the coronavirus pandemic which we passed, now we think that it is the time we move towards the establishing electronic data exchange between our neighbors. With more countries getting involved in the international railway transport, it is important to complete the border crossing formalities efficiently for rail to be considered as a reliable mode of transport to shippers. The efficiency of rail border crossing in turn depends on the efficient flow of the information between the relevant stakeholders. Electronic data exchange and information can speed up completion of border crossing formalities, therefore needs to be promoted and encouraged. We expect ESCAP countries, particularly the TAR members, to support the adoption of the proposal annexed to the Intergovernmental Agreement on Trans-Asian Network as the next working group meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Abdullahi, for highlighting several very important initiatives, including that really remarkable initiative on the establishment of a formalized document on electronic exchange between railways. So we are looking forward to those discussions at the platform of the working group on the Trans-Asian Railway next year. Thank you again. Distinguished participants. Yes, now we moved a little bit at trade aspect of our today's topic, and I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Elizabeth Chelia, sorry if I mispronounced your name, Deputy Director and Principal Trade Specialist of the Ministry of Trade and Industry of Singapore. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, ESCAP, for inviting me to speak at this side event. Speaking from the trade angle and speaking as someone who now advises businesses quite a lot on how to navigate these various trade agreements, the one thing that is important to business is how they can be nimble in times of crisis. So there are various sorts of crises. I noted that most of my earlier speakers have focused a lot on the pandemic, but there are other sorts of crises as well. You know, in Singapore, you cannot open the newspaper about reading about food crisis now that's arising because of the Ukrainian conflict and various other initiatives. So then how do we respond to these crises? How do we then change your supply chain, be nimble enough to diversify? So I'm going to look at it from three different points. First of all, the first and most important trade agreement is actually the WTO multilateral trade agreements. Why is it most important? Because these rules apply to all WTO members. So as you reduce tariffs for everybody, it then becomes easier for businesses to see how to diversify, because it's the same rule, the same treatment, no matter who they are sourcing from or supplying to. So for some time, we have stopped paying attention to what the WTO is doing. I will encourage ESCAP as part of your program to maybe relook at some of these initiatives, you know, where they help businesses be able to be nimble, to diversify, and to be able to continue with their supply and purchase of goods in times of crisis. And then it depends on the type of crisis that we are talking about. So in the pandemic, you saw a lot of issues relating to regulatory coherence, convergence, because we needed to make sure that the goods required for pandemic necessities, the medical devices, your masks, your PPE, your medicines, all needed to be coming in and out of your country as expeditiously as possible. And therefore, for that reason, the trade agreement should try to see how to have mutual recognition, approvals, all being expedited by the health authorities so that the goods are not held up at the port, at the railway, or even at wherever they are coming from. So regulatory coherence is another part of the trade agreements that we should be looking into. The third point then brings me then to the vast expansion of bilateral and regional free trade agreements. You will find that bilateral trade agreements provide a lot of leeway for between two countries. But if something goes wrong with either of the two, then you're a bit stuck. So this is why we are noticing a gradual move towards regional FTAs, which gives businesses more opportunities to be able to diversify, to be nimble. We have two such FTAs that I was involved in, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Agreement under by ASEAN and the ASEAN member countries. Why do these agreements help businesses? What are the provisions? Because they are following the same rule book. So if something happens, if you're actually, let's say, for example, Singapore, Malaysia, we're doing a lot of trade, and then something happens. So how do we diversify out? We have other members within the agreement that we can look to that are working on the same rule book. A minor point that I would like to raise in this context is looking at how you should have them flexible rules of origin. It has been very tempting, especially in the earlier FTAs, to focus a lot on regional value computations and accumulation, because you want to have a binding supply chain within that region itself. So you're looking to force sourcing distribution within the FTA partners. But in times of crisis, this may not always work for business, because if they still want to maintain the expeditious preferential trade that is going on, they need to be able to say that whatever I'm manufacturing here can still go to another FTA partner. And this is why when you're doing the rules of origin, we are noticing that there should be a shift perhaps towards tariff shift provisions and process rules, because then whatever is made is substantially transformed in your country. No matter from where you're sourcing the inputs, you can still trade expeditiously with your partners. The third area is that in some of the FTA agreements, we are also making sure that the non-tariff measures, the protectionist measures are minimized. For example, just relating to all the transportation information that has come up, you have provisions in which you are making sure that countries do not dictate that the goods can only move in and out over one route. You must be able to allow the goods or the containers used in international traffic to exit the territory on any route that is reasonably related to economical and prompt departure. If you have that provision, then the goods, and all the corridor routes that my earlier speakers referred to can be used, because the businesses then say, okay, I'm not stuck to just using this one, I can do something else. All the multimodal provisions can then come into play as well, and the documentation relating to this would then also be very useful. The last point I would like to make, which is what we have noticed that affected all of us during the pandemic, is the shortage of labor. The shortage of labor because there was lockdown, and this shortage of labor then has also resulted in slowing down or clearing of containers and moving of goods in many of the ports. Singapore, because we are already short of manpower, we have already taken a lot of initiatives to use automation to clear the goods. So this might be something in addition to electronic data interchange. Also consider how you can bring in more automation, clearance of goods for transportation, so that even if your manpower is locked down, you can still operate and not come to a standstill. These are the few points that I thought I would raise. We have limited time, so that's it for me for now, but happy to, if there's any other questions, to explore this further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your brief overview and for, for indicating very key points, very professional, very key points of trade agreements that need to be addressed under different challenging circumstances such as COVID-19 pandemic and maybe potentially other extraordinary circumstances that may unfortunately occur. So with that, we have the last speaker in our list today, and that is Ms. Tracy Epps, member of the core expert group on the Initiative on Model Provisions for Trade in Times of Crisis and Pandemic. Please, Ms. Epps, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. So I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about what I think trade agreements can do in a crisis situation. And I first worked on this issue back in 2020 when ESCAP ran a hackathon on building back better after COVID. So for that hackathon, I worked with 2 colleagues to draft a model chapter for a free trade agreement that would help to set the parameters for how countries could work together, both to prepare for and to respond to a crisis. So at the time of the hackathon in 2020, supply chains were top of mind for us because we were seeing so many disruptions. I'm from New Zealand, which is very far away from most of our trading partners. So this was something of real interest to us. For us, we have no railways and we're totally reliant on air and sea transport. So much of our attention at that time was actually on the impact of government measures such as export restrictions. But since that time, we've obviously seen that there are many other causes of supply chain disruptions as well, which go well beyond those government restrictions. So with that in mind, I want to explain what we included in the draft chapter, and then I'll make some comments based on what's happened in the 2 years since. So one of the things we saw in 2020 was that there was a real lack of coordination. Governments were taking a variety of approaches. Some of them were putting in place protectionist measures such as export restrictions, while others were actually liberalizing trade by, for example, reducing tariffs. So that lack of coordination led us to focus on 3 aspects. First was the importance of cooperation between countries in a crisis. Second was the importance of transparency. And third, we thought that the best time to prepare for a crisis is before the crisis, and that it's also important to learn from past experiences so that our responses can be improved the next time. And so we built these concepts into a draft model free trade agreement chapter, but it's something that could also be used in the WTO context. So a key aspect for us was to design provisions that would be relevant in any type of crisis that has cross-border implications. So not just a pandemic, but any other crisis as well. So we began the chapter essentially with a provision where the parties recognise the importance and the value of international and regional cooperation where you do have a crisis in order to ensure the continued benefits of economic integration. And then what we did was to list 3 objectives for this draft chapter. The first one was to promote cooperation and transparency and information sharing. The second was to prevent unintended economic and humanitarian harm that could result from a lack of coordination in a party's response to a crisis. And third was to ensure that parties reject protectionism and don't turn inwards. Following that, we set out 3 key assumptions and 2 sort of general obligations. So very quickly, the key assumptions were, first, that in a crisis situation, it's both necessary and desirable to have a coordinated regional and international response in order to continue or to ensure the continued free flow of goods and services and people. Second, we assumed the importance of ensuring that trade lines remain open to facilitate the flow of goods. And thirdly, we assume the important contribution that an open global market makes to the healthy recovery of economies. We then introduced 2 general obligations. The first, while we recognise the right of every party to set its own policies in a crisis to address public welfare objectives, we also would require each party to exercise restraint from imposing trade restrictions, and also to exercise restraint in the kinds of measures that they impose to stimulate exports. Every country had to do that, we understand that, but not in a WTO inconsistent way. The second general obligation, we drew on wording from the G20 Leaders Declaration at that time to require each party to make sure that any emergency measures that they put in place would be targeted, proportionate, transparent and temporary, and do not create unnecessary barriers to trade or disruption to global supply chains. So the way in which we envisaged the chapter working was that we thought you would have every free trade agreement has some kind of governing body, and we thought that that governing body could make a declaration of a crisis, and that declaration would trigger some of the obligations on cooperation and transparency. I won't go into the details there, but the key thing was that it had to be an extraordinary situation that affects more than one territory. And like I said, it wasn't limited to any particular kind of crisis. So natural disasters, financial events, wars, and so on. We also tried to address the sort of temporal aspect of it, recognizing that a crisis has many stages and can flow into the recovery period as well. The core of our model chapter really lay in provisions on cooperation. And so we included obligations to cooperate to address matters of mutual interest related to individual and collective responses to a crisis situation. We had sort of legally binding obligations to cooperate, but left flexibility as to what that cooperation might look like. And we included illustrative lists of potential cooperative activities. Finally, we also had obligations on transparency and information sharing and establishment of a committee to implement the obligations. And one last thing was we were also very cognizant of the importance of bringing the private sector into the picture to make sure that you really have a coordinated approach in the event of a crisis. And so what we suggested, and this was inspired by academic Sherry Stevenson, who's written about supply chains, was the idea of establishing supply chain councils to map sector-specific supply chains and identify how those supply chains work. And so our draft model chapter would require parties to actually consider establishing working groups with representatives from the private sector to map out supply chains. So just to finish the last minute or two, just what has happened since 2020. So just to sort of highlight very briefly 4 key developments that I've noticed. One, I guess, is we've just seen increasing uncertainty and geopolitical tensions. And I guess we're really seeing that it's not a case of the pandemic receding and the world going back to normal. So what that really means, I think, is that supply chain disruption is likely to stay. If I was drafting the chapter now, I would probably still include the crisis response element because it is really important, but I'd probably also want to bring in more of a concept of sustained supply chain resiliency. We've also seen that onshoring can create all kinds of disastrous impacts, as for example, highlighted at the moment by the United States infant formula shortage. Thirdly, we've actually seen all kinds of great initiatives, including from UN ESCAP, from individual businesses who've had to sort of figure out how their own supply chains work. And we've seen multilateral efforts, such as the Asia Development Bank, which has created an interactive mapping tool for supply chains. And fourthly, this week, we're seeing that the United States pursuing its Indo-Pacific economic framework with some countries from the Asia-Pacific region. And one of the pillars of that initiative is supposed to include is supply chain resilience. So just sort of as a final thought, one thing I've been doing is looking through some of the submissions that businesses in the United States have been putting forward as part of that process and what they're saying about supply chain resiliency. And what I found quite interesting is that a really overarching theme of this, and what a lot of businesses are talking about when they talk about supply chain resiliency, is all the kinds of things that we actually see already in the WTO and free trade agreement. It's about eliminating tariffs. It's about not having quantitative restrictions. It's about having robust and consistent regulatory standards, about streamlining, border clearance processes. So a lot of it is really the kinds of things that we're already doing, but that we just need to keep doing and I guess do better. There's also some new ideas out there, but sort of aware that we are getting close to time. So I think I will leave those for now and finish up there. And I'm very happy to take questions as for the last few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Epps, for your very focused intervention, very concise, but very informative. Indeed, so there are a lot of developments that occurred in the previous years, and unfortunately some negative developments are taking place these days, which badly affect trade and transport. And today's event is an example of how relevant the matter of adjusting of legal and regulatory framework to these new practicalities and not always very positive external circumstances is. Unfortunately, so we are very, very limited in time because the main session just starts in about 3 minutes, and we need to let all participants go there. So there'll be, unfortunately, no question and answer session. So with that, I would like to thank all the speakers. And we had, you know, as you saw, we had 5 speakers from 5 different countries representing different parts of our vast Asian, the Pacific subregion, and there are a lot of ideas on what can be done, and a lot of requests, including the request to the Secretariat on what kind of work should be done in this direction in terms of adjusting legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks to trade and transport. As it was mentioned at the beginning, ESCAP has conducted some research and developed some model proposed provisions in the frame of the rapid response project on the COVID-19. But we believe it's just the beginning of very serious work, which will require a lot of efforts to insert the new provisions into regulatory frameworks. First and foremost, a lot of efforts are required from the member states and also from the Secretariat. And with that, we would like to assure the distinguished participants that will be very pleased if we could help and assist in this tremendous work by providing our international platform for negotiation of new treaties and agreements, or agreeing on key principles on how those can be changed, for promotion of different model provisions, including those which were mentioned today, and providing technical assistance to our member states. So we hope that with this collective efforts from member states, supported by not only us, but other development agencies and organizations, so our region will be able to transit to up-to-date legal and regulatory framework for trade and transport, ensuring better sustainability and resilience of supply chains in general. So I wish all of us every success on this long road to this necessary change. And thank you once again, all of you, for joining us today. Have a nice day and stay healthy and safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you.